Stupid neighbor blocks woman's driveway, so she did this. Sarah Thompson stood in the driveway of her grandmother's, now her, house, keys clutched tightly in her hand as memories washed over her like a gentle summer rain. Every scratch on the white wooden porch, every creak of the old swing, and even the familiar scent of roses from the garden held a story from her childhood. At 32, she never expected to inherit this piece of her family's history. But here she was, a single mother starting a new chapter in the very place where she'd spent countless weekends as a little girl. "Mommy, can I have the blue bedroom?" her 8-year-old daughter Emma called out, already racing up the creaky stairs with the boundless energy only children possess. Sarah couldn't help but smile, remembering how she'd claimed that same room during her summer stays with Grandma Rose. "Of course, sweetie. Just be careful with..." Sarah's response was cut short by the aggressive roar of an engine. A sleek black Mercedes pulled into her driveway, blocking her moving truck. The car door swung open, and out stepped a man in his 40s, wearing an expensive suit that seemed at odds with the modest neighborhood. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I didn't realize anyone was moving in today." He flashed what Sarah would later come to recognize as his trademark real estate agent's smile, all teeth and no warmth. "I'm Greg Mitchell," he continued, extending a manicured hand. "I live next door, and I actually have a rather interesting proposition for you." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, very aware that her moving truck was now effectively trapped. "I'm Sarah Thompson. This was my grandmother's house." "Ah, Rose's granddaughter." Greg's eyes lit up with recognition, but not the kind that brought comfort. "You know, I've been keeping an eye on this property for years. The market in this area is really heating up. I could offer you a very generous price, save you the hassle of moving in altogether." Sarah felt her grandmother's keys dig into her palm as she gripped them tighter. "I'm not interested in selling. This is our home now." Greg's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of frustration, quickly masked. "Well, think about it. Old houses like this can be challenging, especially for a single mother." The way he emphasized those last two words made Sarah's skin crawl. How did he know about her personal life? "I need to finish unloading the truck," Sarah said firmly, gesturing to where his Mercedes was blocking her driveway. "Oh, right, of course." Greg chuckled, but made no immediate move toward his car. Instead, he surveyed the house with the calculating gaze of someone assessing a potential investment. "You know, I've flipped several properties in this neighborhood. Turned quite a profit. This place could be worth double, maybe triple with the right renovations." "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah interrupted, her patience wearing thin. "I really need to get my daughter settled." Finally, Greg retreated to his car, but not before leaving his business card on Sarah's moving truck dashboard. "Just in case you change your mind," he called out as he backed away, taking an unnecessarily long time to maneuver out of her driveway. That night, after Emma had finally fallen asleep in her new old blue bedroom, Sarah sat on the porch swing, running her fingers along the worn chains just as she had countless times as a child. The house creaked and settled around her, familiar sounds that should have brought comfort. But something felt off. She pulled out her phone and Googled Greg Mitchell. The results painted a picture of a successful local real estate agent, specializing in property transformation opportunities. Several news articles praised his ability to revitalize neighborhoods, though reading between the lines, Sarah recognized the euphemisms for gentrification. A week passed, and Sarah began to settle into a routine. She'd drop Emma at school, head to her job as a graphic designer at a local marketing firm, and spend evenings helping Emma with homework or tending to her grandmother's beloved rose garden. But Greg's Mercedes became a recurring obstacle. The first time, she found it parked halfway across her driveway when she returned from work. Greg appeared from his house immediately, all apologies. "Oh, I'm so sorry." Force of habit, Rose used to let me use this space sometimes. It was a lie. Sarah knew her grandmother would never have allowed that. The second time, he took nearly an hour to move his car, causing Emma to be late for her piano lesson. The third time, He claimed he was on an important client call and couldn't move it right away. Each time, his smile grew a little more smug, his excuses a little more transparent. It was like a game to him, testing how far he could push before she snapped. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Sarah returned home to find Greg's Mercedes once again blocking her driveway, this time completely. Emma was tired and hungry after a long day at school, and Sarah had reached her breaking point. She marched next door and rang Greg's doorbell, rain soaking through her work blazer. When he opened the door, she noticed he was dressed casually, clearly not involved in any important business meetings. "Mr. Mitchell, you need to move your car. Now." "Sarah, I was just about to move it. You know how it is with client calls." He gestured vaguely at his empty living room. "There is no client call," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her rising anger. "You're doing this on purpose, and it needs to stop." Greg's facade cracked for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculated beneath. "You know, Sarah, life would be so much easier if you just consider my offer. This neighborhood is changing. Property values are rising. It would be a shame if you missed out on the opportunity." As Sarah stood there in the rain, she suddenly understood. This wasn't just about buying her house. This was about power. Greg Mitchell was used to getting his way, to pushing people until they gave in. He saw her as an easy target, a single mother, overwhelmed with a new home and a full-time job. But he had made one crucial mistake. He hadn't realized that this house represented more than just property to Sarah. It was her heritage, her daughter's future, and her grandmother's legacy. And Sarah Thompson was not about to let a manipulative neighbor bully her out of what was rightfully hers. What she didn't know then was that Greg's driveway games were just the beginning, the opening moves in a battle that would test her resolve in ways she never imagined. But as she walked back to her car, rain mixing with angry tears, Sarah made a silent promise to her grandmother. She would protect this home, no matter what it took. The crisp morning air was shattered by the sound of official paper being slapped against Sarah's front door. She opened it to find a bright orange notice from the city's Property Standards Department glaring back at her. Her heart sank as she read the violations listed: overgrown vegetation, improper waste disposal, and deteriorating fence conditions. The fine, $500. Sarah walked through her yard bewildered. The roses were perfectly trimmed. She maintained them just as her grandmother had taught her. The trash bins were neatly lined against the garage, and the white picket fence, though old, was sturdy and well maintained. None of these violations made sense. "Everything okay, Sarah?" Greg's voice floated over from his yard, dripping with false concern. He was watering his immaculate lawn, designer sunglasses perched on his nose. "Those orange notices can be quite troublesome." Sarah's reply was cut short by Emma's voice from inside. "Mom! The internet isn't working again." It was the third time this week the connection had mysteriously failed, despite the technician finding nothing wrong with their equipment. That afternoon, while Sarah was on the phone disputing the violations with the city, a sharp knock interrupted her. A stern-faced man in a khaki uniform stood at her door, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Thompson? I'm Inspector Morris from the City Code Enforcement Office. We've received multiple complaints about this property in the past week alone." Sarah's stomach churned. "Multiple complaints? From whom?" "I'm afraid that information is confidential," Inspector Morris replied, adjusting his glasses. "But I have reports here for improper fence height, unauthorized landscape modifications, and—" He paused, squinting at his clipboard. "A possible illegal basement renovation? Basement renovation? I haven't touched the basement," Sarah protested, leading the inspector through her home. As they descended the stairs, she noticed something odd: fresh scrape marks on the concrete floor, as if someone had recently moved heavy equipment. The inspector spent an hour documenting every minor flaw he could find. Through the window, Sarah caught glimpses of Greg pacing in his yard, phone pressed to his ear, watching the inspection unfold. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Sarah found another envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a printed property assessment, showing her house's current market value. along with a handwritten note. Before things get worse. Gee. The next day brought more surprises. The rosebushes her grandmother had tenderly cultivated for decades were dying, their leaves yellowing mysteriously. Sarah discovered unusual granules scattered around their roots. Someone had poisoned them with herbicide. While photographing the damage, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Hidden behind one of the dying bushes was a small electronic device. She recognized it from her IT days, a signal jammer, capable of disrupting Wi-Fi connections. The pieces of their internet problems suddenly fell into place. "Quite a shame about those roses," Greg commented from his driveway, startling her. He was loading photography equipment into his Mercedes. "You know, maintaining an old property like this can be overwhelming. One thing breaks, then another and another." "Did you do this?" Sarah demanded, holding up the signal jammer. Greg's smile never wavered. "Do what?" "I'm just a concerned neighbor watching property values. Speaking of which," he pulled out his phone, showing her a real estate listing. "A developer just offered 7 figures for the Anderson place down the street. But this house, well, with all these violations and problems, you'd be lucky to get half that." Sarah spent her lunch break the next day at the city offices, trying to appeal the violations. The clerk seemed sympathetic but unhelpful. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but once a complaint is filed, we have to investigate. And these complaints are very detailed." She slid a folder across the desk. Sarah's eyes widened as she saw pages of meticulously documented violations, complete with professional quality photographs. She recognized the photography style, identical to the real estate photos on Greg's website. That night, Sarah sat at her grandmother's old kitchen table, surrounded by violation notices and property assessments. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Every week you stay makes this house worth less. Smart investors know when to cut their losses." Emma's voice drifted down from upstairs. "Mom, can you help me with my history project? We're studying family heritage." Sarah's throat tightened. This house wasn't just property. It was Emma's connection to her great-grandmother, to their family story. The doorbell rang. It was Inspector Morris again, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Thompson, we've received another anonymous complaint. Something about unauthorized tree removal?" "What trees?" Sarah asked, exasperated. "Nothing's been removed. The complaint includes historical satellite imagery showing 3 oak trees that are no longer present," he explained, producing more professional photographs. "Those trees were removed legally by my grandmother 15 years ago," Sarah protested. "Nevertheless, we'll need to see the original removal permits," Morris sighed. "And there may be fines for unauthorized removal, even if it was years ago." As the inspector left, Sarah noticed Greg in his yard, apparently on a business call. His words drifted clearly through the evening air. "Yes, the property's value is dropping fast. Multiple code violations, possible legal issues. I'd say the owner will be motivated to sell very soon. I can guarantee you'll get it for a steal." Sarah's hands trembled as she closed her door. The violations, the dying roses, the internet disruption, the fake complaints, it was all an orchestrated campaign. Greg wasn't just being opportunistic. He was systematically trying to break her down, to force her out of her home. But as she helped Emma with her heritage project that night, something shifted in Sarah's resolve. If Greg wanted a war, she would give him one. It was time to fight back, not just for herself, but for every memory this house held, for her grandmother's legacy, and for Emma's future. What Sarah didn't realize was that her grandmother had left her more than just a house. She had left her the key to turning this entire situation on its head. The truth was hidden in the property's history, waiting to be discovered. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she connected the last wire of the security camera system. After weeks of mysterious incidents, she'd invested a significant portion of her savings in a professional-grade surveillance setup. 6 cameras now provided comprehensive coverage of her property, their tiny red lights blinking steadily in the growing darkness. "Mom, why do we need cameras?" Emma asked, hugging her stuffed giraffe close. Is it because of the bad things happening to our house? Sarah's heart ached at the worry in her daughter's voice. It's just to keep us safe, sweetie. Like having a digital guard dog. She forced a smile, not wanting Emma to see how deeply Greg's campaign of harassment had affected her. The cameras proved their worth faster than Sarah expected. At 2 a.m. that very night, her phone buzzed with motion alerts. On the crystal-clear footage, she watched Greg methodically spreading garbage across her front lawn, coffee grounds, torn papers, and what looked like rotting food scraps. He worked with the precision of someone who'd done this many times before, wearing dark clothing and carefully avoiding direct views of his face. The next morning, as Sarah cleaned up the mess before Emma could see it, Greg emerged from his house for his morning jog. "My goodness," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the early morning air. "You really should invest in some proper garbage bins. The raccoons around here can be quite persistent." Sarah straightened up, clutching a handful of trash. "Actually, I have some interesting footage from last night if you'd like to see it." For just a moment, Greg's practiced smile slipped. Then he laughed, but there was an edge to it. "Cameras? Rather paranoid, don't you think? Though I suppose when you can't maintain your property properly, everything starts to feel like a threat." 3 hours later, Sarah returned from dropping Emma at school to find her mailbox knocked completely off its post, lying in the street as if hit by a vehicle. Tire tracks in the dewy grass led straight to Greg's driveway. The security footage showed his Mercedes accidentally backing into the mailbox 3 times until it finally broke free. Sarah took the footage to the local police station, but the response was frustratingly dismissive. "Property disputes between neighbors are civil matters, ma'am," the officer explained, barely glancing at the video. "Unless there's a direct threat to personal safety, we recommend working it out between yourselves." When Sarah called the city about the mailbox incident, she hit another wall. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but we already have an open complaint about your non-regulation mailbox placement," the clerk informed her. "You'll need to ensure any replacement meets current code requirements." That afternoon, Sarah watched through her home office window as Greg parked his Mercedes across her driveway yet again. This time, he left it there for 4 hours while he worked from home. When she finally confronted him, his response was pure theatrical innocence. "Oh my, is it really that late?" He checked his watch with exaggerated surprise. "Time flies when you're closing big deals. You know, I just sold the property for triple its purchase price. Amazing what the right owner can do with a place." The psychological toll was mounting. Sarah found herself jumping at every car door slam, checking the cameras obsessively, and struggling to sleep. Even Emma's cheerful resilience was beginning to crack. "Jenny from school asked why our house looks abandoned," Emma mentioned one evening, pushing her dinner around her plate. "Her mom said it's bringing down property values." Sarah's hands clenched under the table. Greg wasn't just harassing her anymore. His campaign was affecting Emma's social life at school. The thought of her daughter being ostracized because of their problem house made her blood boil. The next morning, Sarah opened her front door to find her entire garage door covered in spray paint. The message, "Sell and leave," glared at her in bright red letters, drips still wet in the morning sun. As she stood there in shock, her phone pinged with a text from Greg. "Terrible neighborhood vandals these days. I know a great pressure washing service, though they might need to see your permit for the garage's historical modification first. Shame if the city had to get involved again." The security footage from overnight showed a tall figure in dark clothing doing the spray painting, but they'd worn a hooded jacket and kept their face turned away from the cameras. Greg was learning, adapting his tactics to avoid clear evidence. That evening, Sarah tried calling the city again about the mounting harassment. As she waited on hold, she noticed something odd through her window. Greg was hosting what appeared to be an impromptu open house next door, leading a group of potential buyers on a tour of his property. She could hear his voice carrying across the yard. "And yes, while this neighborhood has some challenging elements at the moment," he gestured vaguely towards Sarah's house, "I have it on good authority that certain properties will be changing hands soon. perfect opportunity for the right investors to get in early. Sarah's hand tightened on her phone as she watched the prospective buyers shake their heads sympathetically, looking at her house with barely disguised disdain. Greg had managed to turn her home into a cautionary tale, a blight on the neighborhood that justified his promises of revitalization. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, Sarah sat in her grandmother's old reading chair, surrounded by the mounting evidence of Greg's campaign against her. The security footage played silently on her laptop, Greg's repeated driveway blocks, the garbage spreading, the mailbox incident, the spray painting. Each clip showed a man who thought he was untouchable, who believed he could simply wear her down until she gave up. But as Sarah watched the footage for the 100th time, her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper in her memory. "Sometimes, sweetheart, the best defense is buried in the past." Sarah's eyes drifted to the old filing cabinet in the corner, where her grandmother had kept decades of property records and correspondence. Maybe it was time to do some digging of her own, not just into her property's history, but into every detail of how this neighborhood had been developed. What she would discover in those files would change everything, but first, she had to find it. The basement air was thick with dust as Sarah pulled another box of her grandmother's records from the shelves. It was nearly midnight, and she'd been digging through decades of paperwork for hours. Emma was sleeping over at a friend's house, giving Sarah the chance to fully immerse herself in her investigation. Her grandmother, Rose, had kept everything: property tax records, utility bills, correspondence with neighbors, even handwritten notes about boundary disputes from the 1970s. As Sarah sifted through the yellowed papers, a pattern began to emerge. Something about the property lines in the neighborhood seemed off. A coffee-stained envelope caught her eye. Inside was a survey map from 1962, before any of the current houses except her grandmother's had been built. Sarah spread it out on the old workbench, comparing it to a recent property map she'd pulled from the county records office. "That can't be right," she muttered, pulling out her phone's calculator. She checked the measurements 3 times, her heart beginning to race. According to the original survey, her grandmother's property extended a full 15 feet further than the current boundary, right into where Greg's house now stood. Sarah dug deeper, her fingers trembling as she opened more files. She found a letter from 1985 addressed to her grandmother from the previous owners of Greg's property, the Andersons. They were requesting permission to build their new home partially on Rose's land, promising formal paperwork would follow. But as Sarah searched through the subsequent years of records, she found no evidence that the property line had ever been officially redrawn. No deed transfer, no boundary adjustment, no easement agreement, nothing. Just an informal letter and a handshake deal between trusting neighbors. "Oh, Grandma," Sarah whispered. "You never got it in writing, did you?" Dawn was breaking when Sarah finally emerged from the basement, her arms full of crucial documents. She spent the morning scanning everything, creating digital copies before calling a real estate attorney recommended by a colleague. "Ms. Thompson?" Lawrence Chen's voice was crisp and professional over the phone. "I can see you in my office at 2 p.m. Bring every document you have." The law office was a stark contrast to Sarah's dusty basement, all gleaming glass and polished wood. Mr. Chen, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s, examined the documents with growing interest. "This is quite something," he said finally, removing his reading glasses. "The statute of limitations doesn't apply here because there was never a formal transfer of property rights. Your grandmother's verbal agreement with the Andersons wasn't legally binding, and subsequent property sales couldn't transfer land that the sellers didn't legally own." "So what does that mean?" Sarah asked, her throat dry. "It means," Mr. Chen said, leaning forward, "that approximately 20% of Mr. Mitchell's house is sitting on land that still legally belongs to you. His deed is invalid for that portion of the property." Sarah's mind reeled. "But his house is already built there." "Exactly." Mr. Chen's smile was razor-sharp. "And unless he can prove a formal transfer of land rights, which your records clearly show never happened, he has no legal claim to that portion of the property. He'd be required to either purchase the land from you at current market value or what?" or remove any structures encroaching on your property. In other words, he'd have to partially demolish his house. Sarah sat back stunned. All this time, Greg had been terrorizing her, trying to force her out of her home, and he was the one with an invalid property claim. Mr. Chin spent the next hour outlining their legal strategy. They would file an official survey request, followed by a formal complaint about the boundary encroachment. The process would be public record, something a real estate agent like Greg couldn't ignore. One more thing, Mr. Chin added as Sarah stood to leave. I took the liberty of looking into Mr. Mitchell's recent property dealings. He's got 5 other houses in the neighborhood under contract, all contingent on his ability to revitalize the area. If word gets out about this boundary issue, his entire investment plan would collapse. Sarah finished, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd discovered. That evening, as Sarah tucked Emma into bed, her daughter noticed her barely contained excitement. Did something good happen, Mom? Let's just say I found some very interesting old papers in Great-Grandma Rose's basement. Sarah replied, kissing Emma's forehead. Sometimes the best treasures are hidden in dusty old boxes. Later, Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching Greg's house next door. The lights were on, and she could see him pacing, phone pressed to his ear. She wondered if he had any idea what was coming. She thought about all the sleepless nights, the harassment, the fear, and the helplessness she'd felt. Greg had counted on her being an easy target, a single mother who would break under pressure and sell her home for a fraction of its worth. He never imagined she'd find the one thing that could bring his entire scheme crashing down. Sarah pulled out her phone and composed a simple email to Mr. Chin. Please proceed with the survey request first thing tomorrow. As she pressed send, she noticed a text from Greg. Final offer 30% below market value. This neighborhood isn't getting any better for you. Sarah smiled, thinking of the property survey that would soon be underway. Greg was right about one thing. The neighborhood was about to change, but not in the way he expected. The tables were about to turn, and for the first time since this battle began, Sarah felt herself truly looking forward to tomorrow. What she didn't know was that Greg's reaction to the discovery would test her resolve in ways she never expected, pushing their conflict to its ultimate climax. The morning the surveyors arrived, Sarah watched from her kitchen window as Greg's confident facade crumbled in real time. The men in bright yellow vests methodically placed their equipment, driving stakes into the ground and stretching measuring tape across what Greg had always assumed was his property. Excuse me. Greg's voice carried across the lawn, its usual smoothness replaced by barely concealed panic. There must be some mistake. I have no survey scheduled. Order comes from the county assessor's office. One of the surveyors replied, not looking up from his theodolite. Requested by Lawrence Chin on behalf of Sarah Thompson. Sarah stepped onto her porch, coffee mug in hand, just in time to see Greg's face turn an interesting shade of pale. Their eyes met across the yard, and for the first time since this battle began, it was Greg who looked away first. Within an hour, the survey team had marked the true property line with bright orange paint and flags. The line cut directly through Greg's home office and master bathroom, exactly where the original 1962 boundary showed it should be. Greg's phone began ringing incessantly. Sarah could hear fragments of his increasingly desperate conversations. No, the development deal isn't at risk. Just a minor property dispute. Of course the boundary records are clear. But they weren't clear, and Greg knew it. By afternoon, his Mercedes was parked in Sarah's driveway again, not to block her in this time, but because he was practically running to her front door. Sarah! His smile was frantic, nothing like his usual polished demeanor. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Why don't we discuss this over coffee? I know a great little place downtown. I prefer to have this conversation through our lawyers, Mr. Mitchell, Sarah replied calmly. I believe Mr. Chin has already reached out to your office. Look, Greg's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. Whatever you think you found, we can work something out. Name your price. Sarah leaned against her doorframe, savoring the moment. You mean like all those lowball offers you've been making while trying to harass me out of my home? Speaking of which, She held up her phone, showing the security camera feed. Should we discuss the mysterious garbage incidents? The mailbox? The spray paint? The blood drained from Greg's face. Behind him, a black luxury SUV pulled up to his house. Sarah recognized the driver as Marcus Way, the developer who'd been planning to buy up the neighborhood properties once Greg consolidated them. "Gregory!" Marcus called out, his expression thunderous. "Care to explain why I'm hearing rumors about boundary disputes and invalid deeds? We have 5 properties under contract." Greg spun around, his carefully constructed world beginning to unravel. "Marcus! It's nothing, just a small technical issue." "Technical issue?" Marcus was already pulling out his phone. "The county assessor's office just flagged potential boundary problems with half the properties in this development plan." "Your properties?" Sarah watched as Greg chased after Marcus, their heated conversation carrying across the yard. "The deals aren't finished, I can fix this. Just give me time to negotiate." But Sarah had no intention of making this easy. That afternoon, she sat in Mr. Chen's office, reviewing their legal strategy. "We've filed the official complaint," Chen explained, spreading documents across his desk. "Given the clear evidence of the original boundary and the lack of any formal transfer, we're in an extremely strong position. Mr. Mitchell's house is quite literally built on your land. What are our options?" Sarah asked, though she already had a plan in mind. "We could force him to remove the encroaching portions of his house," Chen said. "But that would be a lengthy legal battle. Alternatively," he slid a document across the desk, "we could offer to sell him the land he's already built on. At current market value, of course." Sarah smiled, thinking of all the sleepless nights, the harassment, the fear Greg had put her and Emma through. "And what is the current market value?" Chen's answering smile was predatory. "Given the recent development interest in the area, which Mr. Mitchell himself has been very publicly promoting, it's quite substantial. Plus, considering the immediate necessity of the sale to prevent partial demolition of his home." The next morning, Greg found a formal letter in his mailbox. Inside was an offer to sell him the land his house was partially built on, for a price that made his previous lowball offers look like pocket change. His counteroffer came within hours, but Sarah stood firm. Through Mr. Chen, she reminded Greg that every day of delay was another day his property's legal status remained in question. And developers, as Greg well knew, hated uncertainty. The final negotiations took place in Mr. Chen's office. Greg sat across the conference table, his designer suit wrinkled, his usual arrogance replaced by barely concealed desperation. "This is highway robbery," he muttered, staring at the final price. "Interesting choice of words," Sarah replied coolly. "Coming from someone who tried to harass and intimidate a single mother out of her family home." Greg's pen hovered over the contract. Behind him, through the office windows, Sarah could see Marcus Way pacing on the sidewalk, phone pressed to his ear. "Tick-tock, Mr. Mitchell," Mr. Chen said mildly. "I believe your development contracts have some rather strict deadlines." The pen scratched across paper. Just like that, Greg signed away a small fortune, far more than he would have paid if he'd simply offered Sarah a fair price for her home in the first place. As they left the office, Sarah heard Greg's phone ringing again. From his expression, it wasn't good news. His development deals were unraveling, his reputation in the real estate community tarnished by the boundary scandal. Sarah walked to her car, feeling lighter than she had in months. She pulled out her phone to text Emma. "How about ice cream to celebrate? I think our neighbor troubles are finally over." What Sarah didn't know was that her victory would have ripple effects throughout the neighborhood, leading to changes that would make her final triumph even sweeter. Spring bloomed in full force as Sarah supervised the installation of her new automated security gate. The elegant iron structure was nothing like the fortress-like barriers she'd originally imagined during Greg's harassment campaign. Instead, it complemented her grandmother's roses, which were flourishing again after being replanted with careful attention to the original garden design. "Mom, it looks like a fairy tale entrance," Emma exclaimed, watching the gate swing smoothly open on its sensors. The driveway beyond had been repaved, featuring a charming brick border that matched the house's historic character. The transformation hadn't stopped at the driveway. Using the money from Greg's land purchase, Sarah had carefully restored every inch of her grandmother's house. The white picket fence gleamed with fresh paint, the porch had been lovingly rebuilt using period-appropriate materials, and solar-powered lanterns lit the garden paths at night. "Mrs. Thompson?" A familiar voice called from the sidewalk. It was Inspector Morris, but this time he wasn't carrying his dreaded clipboard of violations. "I'm here for the final historic preservation inspection. Though I doubt we'll find any issues, your restoration has become something of a model for the neighborhood." Sarah couldn't help but smile at the irony. The same inspector who had once been Greg's unwitting pawn in the harassment campaign was now praising her property as an example of perfect code compliance. Next door, Greg's house stood empty, a for sale sign swaying in the breeze. After the boundary scandal had destroyed his development deals, his reputation in the real estate community had crumbled. The last Sarah had heard, he'd relocated to another state, trying to rebuild his career far from the neighborhood he'd failed to transform. "Sarah, do you have a minute?" Linda Carson from across the street waved, walking over with a stack of papers. "The Neighborhood Heritage Association finally approved our proposal. We're officially a protected historic district now." This was perhaps the sweetest victory of all. In the wake of Greg's departure, Sarah had discovered that many of her neighbors shared her desire to preserve the neighborhood's character. Together, they'd formed an association to prevent aggressive development and protect their community's historic homes. "The funny thing is," Linda continued, "if Greg hadn't tried to force you out, none of us would have realized how vulnerable our properties were to predatory development. You inspired us all to take action." Inside her house, Sarah found Emma working on a school project, a family history presentation featuring photos of the house through generations. There was Sarah's grandmother Rose on the porch in 1962, then Sarah herself as a child in the 1990s, and finally, Emma in the present day, all in front of the same beloved home. "Look what I found in the attic, Mom!" Emma held up a dusty photo album. Inside was a picture that made Sarah's heart skip. Her grandmother Rose standing with Mrs. Anderson, Greg's house visible in the background during its construction. Both women were smiling, clearly friends who trusted each other enough to make that fateful handshake agreement about the property line. "Your great-grandmother would be so proud," Sarah said, hugging Emma close. "She protected this house for us, even if she didn't know it at the time." The doorbell rang. It was the Taylors, the young family who had just purchased Greg's house. Unlike their predecessor, they had approached Sarah with respect and warmth from day one. "We brought housewarming cookies," Mrs. Taylor announced, her young son peeking shyly around her legs. "And we wanted to ask if Emma might show Tommy around the neighborhood. He's starting at her school next week." As the children ran off to explore, Sarah and Mrs. Taylor, Kate, as she insisted on being called, sat on the porch swing, sharing cookies and getting to know each other. The conversation flowed easily, nothing like the tense, calculated exchanges that had characterized Greg's era. "You know," Kate mentioned, "when we were house hunting, our realtor told us about this neighborhood story, how one homeowner stood up to a developer and inspired the whole community to protect their heritage. We knew right then that this was where we wanted to raise our family." That evening, Sarah hosted a neighborhood potluck in her backyard. Children played on the tire swing that now hung from the old oak tree, while adults chatted and shared dishes passed down through generations. The gathering had become a monthly tradition, strengthening the bonds between neighbors who had discovered their shared values. Looking around at the happy faces, Sarah realized that her victory hadn't just been about keeping her house. It had been about preserving a way of life, a sense of community that no property developer could price. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over her grandmother's roses, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The automated gate stood open, welcoming friends instead of defending against enemies. The security cameras remained, but now they mostly captured moments of joy, children playing, neighbors greeting each other, delivery drivers leaving packages without fear of interference. Emma's voice carried across the yard as she showed Tommy her favorite climbing tree. "And my great-grandma planted these roses, and my mom saved them, and someday they'll be mine to protect too." Sarah smiled, knowing that she'd given Emma more than just a house. She'd given her a legacy of strength, a lesson in standing up for what's right, and a community that looked out for its own. Later that night, as Sarah locked up, she paused at the front door. The porch light illuminated her grandmother's restored rose garden, the new gate, and the peaceful street beyond. In the end, Greg's attempt to force her out had only strengthened her connection to this place and its people. She thought about the old property records, still carefully preserved in the basement filing cabinet. They had been more than just documents. They were a reminder that sometimes the best defense against bullies wasn't a higher wall or a stronger lock, but the courage to stand your ground and the wisdom to know what's truly worth fighting for. Sarah switched off the porch light, the automated gate humming softly as it closed for the night. In her grandmother's house, now truly and securely her own, she was finally, completely, home.